Hello and welcome to part 3 of the read aloud of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. If you're just joining us and haven't been here for part 1 or 2, they are linked in the description down below. And of course, before we get into this, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to do those good YouTube or Rumble things since we're streaming here on both platforms. Like this video, subscribe if you're new here. We do read alouds like this, go through news, trending events, talk about larger philosophical, liberty based ideas. Frederick Douglass, of course, being a pretty foundational thinker when it comes to those ideas. So share out this stream with somebody who you think, or if you're watching the recording, share out this video with somebody who you think could benefit from hearing this, might be interested in this. And, without any further ado, let's hop back into this. Like I said, this is part 3. We're going to be picking up at chapter 8. So in part 1, did a little bit of an intro. It was Memorial Day weekend, so did a little bit of intro around that. Then we read the preface and chapter 1. Part 2, we did chapters 3 to 7. Oh, I'm sorry, it's chapters 2 to 7. And now we're picking up at chapter 8. And if you recall, Frederick Douglass had this opportunity to leave the plantation he was on in Maryland, where, although perhaps comparative to places further south or in other parts of Maryland, wasn't that bad. Going to Baltimore, going to the city, the conditions are again, he's a slave, comparatively better to what they were. And so he talked about really how grateful and how random in a way it was for him to have this opportunity. And of course, when he goes there, that's where he gets the opportunity to learn to read and to go on to write, which we know are some of the most important skills. And I can't remember what the quote is exactly, but he says something about, if you teach a man to read, then he's really free. So let's go ahead and pick back up here. So like I said, we are at chapter 8. Frederick Douglass had been just talking about how he would go around and ask little white boys basically for lessons in how to write letters. And he finally succeeded in learning how to write. And that's where we left off. Chapter 8. In a very short time after I went to live in Baltimore, my old master's youngest son, Richard, died. In about 3 years and 6 months after his death, my old master, Captain Anthony, died, leaving his only son, Andrew, and daughter, Lucretia, to share his estate. He died while on a visit to see his daughter at Hillsborough. Cut off thus unexpectedly, he left no will at the disposal of his property. It was therefore necessary to have a valuation of the property that it might be equally divided between Miss Lucretia and Master Andrew. I was immediately sent for to be valued with the other property. Here again my feelings rose up in detestation of slavery. I had now a new conception of my degraded condition. Prior to this, I had become, if not insensible to my lot, at least partly so. I left Baltimore with a young heart overborne with sadness and a soul full of apprehension. I took passage with Captain Rowe in the schooner Wildcat, and after a sail of about 24 hours, I found myself near the place of my birth. I had now been absent from it almost, if not quite, 5 years. I, however, remember the place well. I was only about 5 years old when I left it to go and live with my old master on Colonel Lloyd's plantation, so that I was now between 10 and 11 years old. We were all ranked together at the valuation, men and women, old and young, married and single. We were ranked with horses, sheep, and swine. There were horses and men, cattle and women, pigs and children, all holding the same rank, the scale of being, and we were all subjected to the same narrow examination. Silvery headed age and sprightly youth, maids and matrons, had to undergo the same indelicate inspection. At this moment, I saw more clearly than ever the brutalizing effects of slavery upon both slave and slaveholder. After the valuation, then came the division. I have no language to express the high excitement and the deep anxiety which were felt among us poor slaves during this time. Our fate for life was now to be decided. We had no more voice in that decision than the brutes among whom we were ranked. A single word from the white man was enough, against all our wishes, prayers, and entreaties, to sunder forever the dearest friends, dearest kindred, the strongest ties known to human beings. In addition to the pain of separation, there was the horrid dread of falling into the hands of Master Andrew. He was known to us all as being a most cruel wretch, a common drunkard who had, by his reckless mismanagement and proliferate dissipation, already wasted a large portion of his father's property. We all felt that we might as well be sold at once to the Georgia traders as to pass into the hands, for we all knew that would be our inevitable condition, a condition held us in all the utmost horror and dread. I suffered more anxiety than most of my fellow slaves. I had known what it was to be treated kindly. They had known nothing of the kind. They had seen little or nothing of the world. They were in very deed men and women of sorrow and acquainted with grief. Their backs had been made familiar with a bloody lash so that they had become callous. Mine was yet tender, for while at Baltimore I had got few whippings, and few slaves could boast of a kinder master and mistress than myself. And the thought of passing out of the hands into those of Master Andrew, a man but for a few days before to give me a sample of his bloody disposition, took my little brother by the throat, threw him on the ground, and with the heel of his boot stamped upon his head till the blood gushed from his nose and ears, was well calculated to make me anxious as to my fate. He had committed this savage outrage upon my brother. He turned to me, or I'm sorry, after he committed this savage outrage upon my brother, he turned to me and said that this was the way he meant to serve me one of these days, meaning, I suppose, when I came into his possession. Thanks to a kind providence, I fell into the portion of Mrs. Lucretia and was sent immediately back to Baltimore to live again in the family of Master Hugh. Their joy at my return equaled their sorrow at my departure. It was uh, it was a glad day to me. I had escaped a worse than lion's jaws. I was absent from Baltimore for more the purpose of valuation and division just about 1 month, and it seemed to have been 6. Very soon after my return to Baltimore, my mistress, Lucretia, died, leaving her husband and one child, Amanda. And in a very short time after her death, Master Andrew died. Now all the property of my old master, slaves included, was in the hands of strangers, strangers who had had nothing to do with accumulating it. Not a free slave was left. I'm sorry, not a slave was left free. All remain slaves from youngest to oldest. If any one thing in my experience more than another served to deepen my conviction of the infernal character of slavery and to fill me with unutterable loathing of slaveholders, it was their base ingratitude to my poor old grandmother. She had served my old master faithfully from youth to old age. She had been the source of all his wealth. She had peopled his plantation with slaves. She had become a great grandmother in his service. She had rocked him in infancy, attended him in childhood, served him through life, and at his death wiped from his icy brow the cold death sweat and closed his eyes forever. She was nevertheless a slave for life, a slave in the hands of a stranger. And in their hands she saw her children, her grandchildren, her great grandchildren divided like so many sheep without being gratified with the small privilege of a single word as to her own destiny. And to cap the climax of their base ingratitude and fiendish barbarity of my grandmother, who was now very old, having outlived my old master and all his children, having seen the beginning and end of all of them, and her present owners finding she was but of little value, her frame already racked with pains of old age and complete helplessness fast stealing over her once active limbs, they took her to the woods, built her a little hut, put up a little mud chimney, and then made her welcome to the privilege of supporting herself in perfect loneliness, thus virtually turning her out to die. If my poor grandmother now lives, she lives to suffer in utter loneliness. She lives to remember and mourn over the loss of children, the loss of grandchildren, the loss of great grandchildren. They are, in the language of the slave's poet, Whittier, gone, gone, sold and gone, to the rice swamp dank and lone, where the slave whip ceaseless swings, where the noisome insect stings, where the forever demon stews, poison with the falling dews, where the stickly sunbeams glare through the hot and misty air, gone, gone, sold and gone, to the rice swamp dank and lone, from Virginia hills and waters, woe is me, my stolen daughters. The heart is desolate. The children, the unconscious children who once sang and danced in her presence, are gone. She gropes her way in the darkness of age for a drink of water. Instead, the voices of her children she hears by day the moans of the dove, and by night the screams of the hideous owl. All is gloom. The grave is at the door. And now, when weighed down by the pains and aches of old age, when the head inclines to the feet, when the beginning and ending of human existence meet, and helpless infancy and painful old age combine together, at this time, the most needful time, the time for exercise of that tenderness and affection which children only can exercise towards a declining parent, my poor old grandmother, the devoted mother of 12 children, is left all alone in yonder little hut before a few dim embers. She stands, she sits, she staggers, she falls, she groans, she dies, and there are none of her children or grandchildren present to wipe from her wrinkled brow the cold sweat of death, or to place beneath the sod her fallen remains. Will not a righteous God visit for these things? In about 2 years after the death of Mrs. Lucretia, Master Thomas married his second wife. Her name was Rowena Hamilton. She was the eldest daughter of Mr. William Hamilton. Master now lived in St. Michael's. Not long after his marriage, a misunderstanding took place between himself and Master Hugh, and as a means of punishing his brother, he took me from him to live with himself at St. Michael's. Here I underwent another most painful separation. It, however, was not so severe as the one I had dreaded at the division of property, for during this interval a great change had taken place in Master Hugh and his once kind and affectionate wife. The influence of brandy upon him and of slavery upon her had effected a disastrous change in the characters of both, so that, as far as they were concerned, I thought I had little to lose by the change. But it was not to them that I was attached. It was to those little Baltimore boys that I felt the strongest attachment. I had received many good lessons from them and was still receiving them, and the thought of leaving them was painful indeed. I was leaving too without the hope of ever being allowed to return. Master Thomas had said he would never let me return again. The barrier betwixt him and his brother he considered impassable. I then had to regret that I did not at the least make the attempt to carry out my resolution to run away, for the chances of success are tenfold greater from the city than from the country. I sailed from Baltimore to St. Michael in the sloop Amanda, Captain Edward Dodson. On my passage, I paid particular attention to the direction which most steamboats took to go to Philadelphia. I found instead of going down on reaching North Point, they went up to the bay in a northeasterly direction. I deemed this knowledge of the utmost importance. My determination to run away was again revived. I resolved to wait only so long as the offering of a favorable opportunity. When that came, I was determined to be off. All right, so we are up to chapter 9. I have now reached a period in my life when I can give dates. I left Baltimore and went to live with Master Thomas Auld at St. Michael's in March of 1832. It was now more than 7 years since I lived with him in the family of my old master on Colonel Lloyd's plantation. We, of course, were now almost entire strangers to each other. He was to me a new master, and I to him a new slave. I was ignorant of his temper and disposition, he was equally so of mine. A very short time, however, brought us into full acquaintance with each other. I was made acquainted with his wife not less than with himself. They were well matched, being equally mean and cruel. I was now, for the first time during a space more than 7 years, made to feel the pain of gnawings of hunger, something which I had not experienced since before I left Colonel Lloyd's plantation. It went hard enough with me then, when I could look back to no period at which I had enjoyed sufficiency. It was tenfold harder after living in Master Hugh's family, where I had always had enough to eat and of which it was good. I have said Master Thomas was a mean man. He was so. Not to give a slave enough to eat is regarded as the most aggravated development of meanness, even among slaveholders. The rule is, no matter how coarse the food, only let there be enough of it. This is the theory, and part of Maryland from which I came, it was the general practice, though there were many exceptions. Master Thomas gave us neither enough coarse nor fine food. There were 4 slaves of us in the kitchen, my sister Eliza, my aunt Priscilla, Henny, and myself. And we were all allowed less than half a bushel of cornmeal per week, and very little else, either in the shape of meat or vegetables. It was not enough for us to subsist upon. We were therefore reduced to the wretched necessity of living at the expense of our neighbors. We did this by begging and stealing whichever came handy in the time of need, and one being considered as legitimate as the other. As great many times we have poor creatures been nearly perishing with hunger when food in abundance lay mouldering in the safe and the smokehouse, and our pious mistresses was aware of the fact, and yet that mistress and her husband would kneel every morning and pray that God would bless them in basket and store. Bad as all slaveholders are, we seldom met one as destitute of every element of character commanding my respect. My master was one of this rare sort. I do not know of one single noble act ever performed by him. The leading trait in his character was meanness. If there was ever any other element in his nature, it was made subject to this. He was mean, and like most other mean men, he lacked the ability to conceal his meanness. Captain Auld was not born a slaveholder. He had been born a poor man, master of only bay craft. He had been born a poor man, master only of a bay craft. He came into possession of all his slaves by marriage, and of all men adopted slaveholders are the worst. He was cruel but cowardly. He commanded without firmness. In the enforcement of his rules, he was at times rigid, at times lax. At times he spoke to his slaves with firmness of Napoleon and the fury of a demon. At other times he might as well be mistaken for an inquirer who had lost his way. He did nothing of himself. He might have passed for a lion but for his ears. In all things noble which he attempted, his own meanness shone most conspicuous. His airs, words, and actions were the were I'm sorry. His heirs, words, and actions were the heirs, words, and actions of born slaveholders and good imitator, and being assumed were awkward enough. He was not even a good imitator. He possessed the disposition to deceive, but wanted the power. Having no resources within himself, he was compelled to be the copyist of many, and being such, he was forever the victim of inconsistency. And of consequence, he was an object of contempt, and he was held such even by his slaves. The luxury of having slaves of his own to wait upon him was something new, and he was unprepared for it. He was a slaveholder without the ability to hold slaves. He found himself incapable of managing his slaves either by force, fear, or fraud. We seldom called him master. We generally called him Captain Ald, and we were hardly disposed to title him at all. I doubt not that our conduct had much to do with making him appear awkward and, of consequence, fretful. Our want of reverence for him must have perplexed him greatly. He wished to have us call him master, but lacked the firmness necessary to command us to do so. His wife used to insist upon our calling him so, but to no purpose. In August 1832, my master attended a Methodist camp meeting held in the Bayside, Talbot County, and there experienced religion. I indulged a faint hope that his conversion would lead him to emancipate his slaves, and that if he did this, it would at any rate make him more kind and humane. I was disappointed in both these respects. It neither made him to be humane to his slaves nor emancipate them. If it had any effect upon his character, it made him more cruel and hateful in all his ways. For I believe him to have been much worse after his conversion than before. Prior to his conversion, he relied upon his own depravity to shield and sustain him through his savage barbarity. But after his conversion, he found religious sanction and support for his slaveholding cruelty. He made the greatest pretensions to piety. His house was the house of prayer. He prayed morning, noon, and night. He very soon distinguished himself among his brethren and was soon made a class leader and exhorter. His activity in revival was great, and he proved himself an instrument in the hands of the church in converting many souls. His house was the preacher's home. They used to take great pleasure in coming there to put up. For a while, he starved us, he stuffed them. We have had 3 or 4 preachers there at a time. The names of those who used to come frequently while I lived there were Mr. Storks, Mr. Ewry, Mr. Humphrey, and Mr. Hickey. I have also seen Mr. George Cookman at our house. We slaves loved Mr. Cookman. We believed him to be a good man. We thought him instrumental in getting Mr. Samuel Harrison, a very rich slaveholder, to emancipate his slaves, and by some means got the impression that he was laboring to effect the emancipation of all slaves. When he was at our house, we were sure to be called into prayers. When the others were there, we were sometimes called and sometimes not. Mr. Cookman took more notice of us than either of our other ministers. Of the other ministers. He could not come among us without betraying his sympathy for us, and stupid as we were, we had the sagacity to see it. While I lived with my master in St. Michael's, there was a white young man, Mr. Wilson, who proposed to keep a Sabbath school for the instruction of such slaves as might be disposed to learn to read the New Testament. We met but 3 times, when Mr. West and Mr. Fairbanks, both class leaders, with many others, came upon us with sticks and other missiles, drove us off, and forbade us to meet again. Thus ended our little Sabbath school in the pious town of St. Michael's. I have said my master found religious sanction for his cruelty. As an example, I will state one of the many facts going to prove the charge. I have seen him tie up a lame young woman and whip her with heavy cowskin upon her naked shoulders, causing the warm blood to drip. And in justification of the bloody deed, he would quote this passage of Scripture: "He that knoweth his master's will and doeseth not shall be beaten with many stripes." Master would keep his lacerated young woman tied up in this horrid situation 4 or 5 hours at a time. I have known him to tie her up early in the morning and whip her before breakfast, leave her, go to his store, return at dinner, and whip her again, cutting her in the places already made raw by his cruel lash. The secret of Master's cruelty toward Henny is found in the fact of her being almost helpless. When quite a child, she fell into the fire and burned herself horribly. Her hands were so burnt that she never got to use them, she never got the use of them. She could do very little but bear heavy burdens. She was to Master a bill of expense, and as he was a mean man, she was a constant offense to him. He deemed desirous of getting the poor girl out of existence. He gave her away once to his sister, but being a poor gift, she was not disposed to keep her. Finally, my benevolent master used his own words, set her adrift to take care of herself. Here was a recently converted man here was a recently converted man holding on upon the mother, and at the same time turning out her helpless child to starve and die. Master Thomas was one of many pious slaveholders who hold slaves for the very charitable purpose of taking care of them. My master and myself had quite a number of differences. He had found me unsuitable to his purpose. My city life, he said, had a very pernicious effect upon me. It had almost ruined me for every good purpose and fitted me for everything which was bad. One of my greatest faults was that of letting his horse run away and go down to his father in law's farm, which was about 5 miles from St. Michael's. I would then have to go after it. My reason for this kind of carelessness or carefulness was that I could always get something to eat when I went there. Master William Hamilton, my master's father in law, always gave his slaves enough to eat. I never left there hungry, no matter how great the need of my speedy return. Master Thomas at length said he would stand it no longer. I had lived with him 9 months, during which time he had given me a number of severe whippings, all to no good purpose. He resolved to put me out, as he said, to be broken, and for this purpose he left me for 1 year to a man named Edward Covey. Mr. Covey was a poor man, a farm renter. He rented the place upon which he lived, as also the hands with which he tilled it. Mr. Covey had acquired a very high reputation for breaking young slaves, and this reputation was of immense value to him. It enabled him to get his farm tilled without much less expense to himself than he could have done it without such reputation. Some slaveholders thought it not much loss to allow Mr. Covey to have one of their slaves for a year, for the sake of training to which they were subjected without any other compensation. He could hire young help with great ease in consequence of his reputation. Added to the natural good qualities of Mr. Covey, he was a professor of religion, a pious soul, a member and class leader of the Methodist Church. All of this added weight to his reputation as a nigger breaker. I was aware of all the facts, having been made acquainted with him as a young man who had lived there. Oh, by a young man who had lived there. I nevertheless made the change gladly, for I was sure of getting enough to eat, which is not the smallest consideration to a hungry man. Drink real quick. We're up to chapter 10. Not an easy book to read. Very stark pictures of life. I was accused today in the comments of my Instagram for not teaching real history, for trying to hide the history of natives and of black people. And it's just obviously baseless and ridiculous. I think that this is foundational American history literature that every student should read before leaving high school. Chapter 10. I left Master Thomas's house and went to live with Mr. Covey on the 1st of January, 1833. I was now, for the first time in my life, a field hand. In my new employment, I found myself even more awkward than a country boy appeared to be in a large city. I'd been at my new home but week before Mr. Covey gave me a very severe whipping, cutting my back, causing the blood to run, and raising ridges on my flesh as large as my little finger. The details of this affair are as follows. Mr. Covey sent me very early in the morning of one of our coldest days in the month of January to the woods to get a load of wood. He gave me a team of unbroken oxen. Which was he told me which was the in-hand ox and which the offhand one. He then tied one end of the large rope around the horns of the in-hand ox and gave me the other end of it. He told me if the oxen start to run, that I must hold on to the rope. I had never driven oxen before, and of course I was very awkward. I, however, succeeded in getting to the edge of the woods with very little difficulty. But I had got a very few rods into the woods when the oxen took fright and started full tilt, carrying the cart against the trees over stumps in the most frightful manner. I expected every moment that my brains would be dashed against the trees. After running thus for a considerable distance, they had finally upset the cart, dashing it with great force against a tree, and threw themselves into a dense thicket. How I escaped death I do not know. There I was entirely alone in a thick wood in a new place to me. My cart was upset and shattered, my oxen were entangled among the young trees, and there was no one to help me. After a long spell of effort, I succeeded in getting my cart righted, my oxen disentangled, and again yoked to the cart. I now proceeded with my team to the place where I had the day before been chopping wood and loaded my cart pretty heavily, uh, thinking in this way to tame my oxen. I then proceeded on out of the wood safely and now felt out of danger. I stopped my oxen to open the wood gates, and just as I did so, before I could get hold of my oxen rope, the oxen was again started, rushed through the gate, catching it between the wheel and my body of the cart, tearing it into pieces, and coming within a few inches of crushing me against the gate post. Thus, twice, in one short day, I escaped death by the merest chance. On my return home, I told Mr. Covey what had happened and how it had happened. He ordered me to return to the woods again immediately. I did so, and he followed on after me. Just as I got into the woods, he came up on to me and told me to stop my cart and that he would teach me how to away my time and break gates. He then went to a large gum tree and with his axe cut 3 large switches. After trimming them up neatly with his pocket knife, he ordered me to take off my clothes. I made him no answer but stood with my clothes on. He repeated his order. I still made him no answer, nor did I move to strip myself. Upon this, he rushed at me with the fierceness of a tiger, tore off my clothes, and uh, lashed me till he had worn me out. His switches, I'm sorry, and lashed me until he had worn out his switches, cutting me so savagely as to leave the marks visible for a long time after. This whipping was the first of a number like it, and for similar offenses. I lived with Mr. Covey for 1 year. During the first 6 months of that year, scarce a week passed without his whipping me. I was seldom free from a sore back. My awkwardness was almost always his excuse for whipping me. We were worked fully from the point of endurance. Long before day we were up, our horses fed, and by the first approach of day we were off the field with our hoes and plowing the teams. Yeah. Mr. Covey gave us enough to eat, but scarce time to eat it. We were often less than 5 minutes taking our meals. We were often in the field from the first approach of day till its last lingering ray had left us, and at that saving fodder time, midnight often caught us in the field, binding blades. Covey would be out with us. The way he used to stand it was this: he would spend the time of his afternoons in bed. He would then come out fresh in the evening, ready to urge us on with words, example, and frequently with the whip. Mr. Covey was one of the few slaveholders who could and did work with his hands. He was a hard-working man. He knew by himself just what a man or a body could do. There was no deceiving him. His work went on, his absence almost as well as his in his presence. He had the faculty of making us feel that he was ever present with us. This he did by surprising us. He seldom approached the spot where we were at work openly, and if he could do it in secret. He always aimed at taking us by surprise. Such was his cunning that we always used to call him among ourselves the snake. When we were at work in the cornfield, we would sometimes crawl on hands and knees to avoid detection, and all at once he would raise nearly in our midst and scream out, "Ha, ha, come, come, dash on, dash on." This being his mode of attack, it was never safe to stop and mingle a minute. His comings were like a thief in the night. He appeared to be ever at hand. He was under a tree, behind a stump, in every bush and at every window on the plantation. He could sometimes mount his horse as if bound to St. Michael's, a distance of 7 miles and a half of an hour towards you. You would see him coiled up in the corner of the wood fence, watching every motion of the slaves. He would, for this purpose, leave his horse tied up in the woods. Again, he would sometimes walk up to us and give us orders as though he was upon the point of starting a long journey, turn his back upon us, and make it as though he was going to the house to get ready. And before he would get halfway there, he would turn short and crawl into a fence corner or behind some tree, and there watch us till he was going down of the sun. Mr. Covey's forte consisted in his power to deceive. His life was devoted to planning and perpetrating the grossest deceptions. Everything in his possession, in the shape of learning or religion, made him conform to his disposition to deceive. He seemed to think of himself equal to deceiving the Almighty. He would make a short prayer in the morning and a long prayer at night, and strange as it may seem, few men would at times appear more devotional than he. The exercises of family devotions were always commenced with singing, and as he was a very poor singer himself, the duty of raising the hymn generally came upon me. He would read his hymn and nod me to commence. I would at times do so, at others I would not. My noncompliance would almost always produce much confusion. To show himself independent of me, he would start and stagger through the hymn, his hymn, in the most discordant manner. In this state of mind, he prayed with more than ordinary spirit. Poor man, such was his disposition and success at deceiving. I do verily believe that he sometimes deceived himself into the solemn belief that he was a sincere worshipper of the Most High God. And this, too, at a time when he may be said to have had the guilty compelling his women slave to commit the sin of adultery. The fact in the case are these. Mr. Covey was a poor man. He was just commencing his life. He was only able to buy one slave, and shocking as the fact, he bought her, and he said, I'm sorry, and shocking as is the fact, he bought her, as he said, for a breeder. This woman was named Caroline. Mr. Covey bought her from Mr. Thomas Lowe, about 6 miles from St. Michael's. She was a large, able bodied woman, about 24 years old. She had already given birth to one child, which proved her to be just what he wanted. After buying her, he hired her a married man of Mr. Samuel Harrison to live with him for 1 year, and him he used to fasten up with her every night. The result was that at the end of the year, the miserable woman gave birth to twins. At this result, Mr. Covey seemed to be highly pleased, both with the man and the wretched woman. Such was his joy and that of his wife, that nothing they could do for Caroline during her confinement was too good or too hard to be done. The children were regarded as being quite an addition to his wealth. If at any one time in my life more than another I was made to drink the biggest dregs of slavery, that time was during the first 6 months of my stay with Mr. Covey. We were worked in all weathers. It was never too hot or too cold. It could never rain, blow, hail, or snow too hard for us to work in the field. Work, work, work was scarcely more the order of the day than of the night. The longest days were too short for him, and the shortest nights too long for him. I was somewhat unmanageable when I first came there, but a few months of discipline tamed me. Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me. And behold, a man transformed into a brute. Sunday was my only leisure time. I spent this in a sort of beast-like stupor between sleep and wake under some large tree. At times I would rise up, a flash of energetic freedom would dart through my soul, accompanied with a faint beam of hope that flickered for a moment and then vanished. I sank down again, mourning over my wretched condition. I was sometimes prompted to take my life and that of Covey, but was prevented by a combination of hope and fear. My sufferings on this plantation seemed now like a dream rather than a stern reality. Our house stood within a few rods of the Chesapeake Bay, whose broad bosom was ever white with sails from every quarter of the habitable globe. Those beautiful vessels, robed in the purest white, so delightful to the eye of freemen, were to me so many shrouded ghosts to terrify and torment me with thoughts of my wretched condition. I have often, in the deep stillness of summer Sabbath, stood all alone in the lofty banks of the noble bay and traced with the saddened heart and tearful eye the countless numbers of sails moving off uh, into the mighty ocean. The sights of these always affected me powerfully. My thoughts would compel utterance, and there, with no audience but the Almighty, I would pour out my soul's complaint in my rude way, with an apostrophe of the moving multitude of ships. You are loosed from your moorings and are free. I am fast in my chains, and I am a slave. You are merrily before the gentle gale, and I sadly before the bloody whip. Your freedom, swift winged angel, that fly round the world. I'm confined in bands of iron. Oh, that I were free. Oh, that I were one of your gallant decks and under your protecting wings. Alas, betwixt me and you, the turbid waters roll. Go on, go on. Oh, that I could go on also. But I swim. If I could fly, oh, why was I born a man of whom to make a brute? The glad ship is gone, the hides in dim distance. I am left in the hottest hell of unending slavery. Oh God, save me. God, deliver me. Let me be free. Is there any God? Why am I a slave? I will run away. I will not stand it. Get caught or get clear. I'll try it. I had as well die with the argue as the fever. I'm sorry, I had as well die with ague as the fever. I had only one life to lose. I had as well be killed running as die standing. Only think of it, 100 miles straight north and I am free. Try it? Yes. God helping me, I will. It cannot be that I shall live and die a slave. I will take to the water. This very bay shall yet bear me to freedom. The steamboat steered in a northeast course from the North Point. I will do the same, and when I get to the head of the bay, I will turn my canoe adrift and walk straight through the Delaware into Pennsylvania. When I get there, I shall not be required to have a pass. I can travel without being disturbed. Let but the first opportunity offer, and come what will, I am off. Meanwhile, I will try to bear up under the yoke. I am not the only slave in the world. Why should I fret? I can bear it as much as any of them. Besides, I am but a boy, and all boys are bound to someone. It may be my misery and slavery will only increase my happiness when I get free. There is a better day coming. Thus I used to think, and thus I used to speak to myself, goaded almost to madness at one moment, and then in the next reconciling myself to my wretched lot. I have already intimated that my condition was much worse during the first 6 months of my stay at Mr. Covey's than in the last. The circumstances leading to my change in Mr. Covey's course towards me form an epoch in my humble history. You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man. One of the most hottest days in the month of August 1833, Bill Smith, William Hughes, a slave named Eli, and myself were engaged in fanning wheat. Hughes was clearing the fanned wheat from before the fan. Eli was turning, Smith was feeding, and I was carrying the wheat to the fan. The work was simple, requiring strength rather than intellect. Yet to one entirely unused to such work, it came very hard. About 3 o'clock of that day, I broke down. My strength failed me. I was seized with a violent aching of the head, attended with extreme dizziness. I trembled in every limb. Finding what was coming, I nerved myself, feeling it would never do to stop work. I stood as long as I could, staggered to hopper with the grain. When I could no longer, I fell, and it felt as if held down by an immense weight. The fan, of course, stopped. Everyone had his own work to do, and no one could do the work of the other and have his own go on at the same time. Mr. Covey was at the house about 100 yards from the treading yard where we were fanning. On hearing the fan stop, he left immediately and came to the spot where we were. He hastily inquired what the matter was. Bill answered that I was sick and there was no one to bring the wheat to the fan. I had by this time crawled away under the side of the post and the rail fence by which the yard was enclosed, hoping to find relief by getting out of the sun. He then asked where I was. He was told by one of the hands. He came to the spot, and after looking at me a while, he asked me what the matter was. I told him as well as I could, for I scarce had the strength to speak. He then gave me a savage kick in the side, told me to get up. I tried to do so, but fell back in the attempt. He gave me another kick and told me to rise. I again tried and succeeded in gaining my feet, but stooping to get to the tub with which I was feeding the fan, I again staggered and fell. While down in this situation, Mr. Covey took up the hickory slat with which Mr. Hughes had been striking off the half-bushel measure, and with it gave me a heavy blow upon the head, making a large wound, and the blood ran freely, and with this again told me to get up. I made no effort to comply, having now made up my mind to let him do his worst. In a short time after receiving this blow, my head grew better. Mr. Covey had now left me to my fate. At this moment, I resolved for the first time to go to my master, enter a complaint, and ask his protection. In order to do this, I must that afternoon walk 7 miles, and this, under the circumstances, was a truly severe undertaking. I was exceedingly feeble, made so as much by the kicks and blows which I received as by the severe fit of sickness which I had been subjected. I, however, watched my chance while Covey was looking in the opposite direction and started for St. Michael's. I succeeded in getting a considerable distance on my way to the woods when Covey discovered me and called for me to come back, threatening what he would do to me if I had not come. I disregarded both his calls and threats and made my way to the woods as fast as my feeble state would allow. And thinking I might be overhauled by him if I kept the road, I walked through the woods, keeping far enough from the road to avoid detection and near enough to prevent losing my way. I had not gone far before my little strength again failed me. I could go no farther. I fell down and I laid for a considerable time. The blood was yet oozing from the wound on my head. For the time I thought I should bleed to death, and think now that I should have done so, but the blood so matted my hair as to stop the wound. After lying there about 3/4 of an hour, I nerved myself up again and started on my way through bogs and briars, barefooted and bareheaded, tearing My feet sometimes at nearly every step, and after a journey of about 7 miles, occupying some 5 hours to perform it, I arrived at my master's store. I then presented an appearance enough to affect anyone but a heart of iron. From the crown of my head to my feet, I was covered with blood. My hair was clotted with dust and blood. My shirt was stiff with blood. My legs and feet were torn in sundry places with briars and thorns, and were also covered with blood. I supposed I looked like a man who had escaped a den of wild beasts and barely escaped them. In this state, I appeared before my master, humbly entreating him to interpose his authority for my protection. I told him all the circumstances as well as I could, and as it seemed as I spoke at times to affect him. He could then walk the floor to seek to justify Covey by saying he expected I deserved it. He asked me what I wanted. I told him to let me get a new home and that I was sure as I live with Mr. Covey again, I should and I was sure as I live with Mr. Covey again, I should live but to die with him. That Covey would surely kill me. He was in a fair way for it. Master Thomas ridiculed the idea that there was any danger of Mr. Covey killing me, and said he knew Mr. Covey, that he was a good man, and that he could not think of taking me from him, that should he do so, he would lose the whole year's wages, that I belonged to Mr. Covey for 1 year, and that I must go back to him, come what might, and that I must not trouble him with any more stories, or that he would himself get a hold of me. After threatening me thus, he gave me a very large dose of salts, telling me that I might remain in St. Michael's the night, or it being quite late, but that I must be back off to Mr. Covey's early in the morning, and that if I did not, he would get a hold of me, which meant that he would whip me. I remained all night, and according to his orders, I started off to Covey's in the morning, Saturday morning, wearied in the body, broken in spirit. I got no supper that night or breakfast in the morning. I reached Covey's about 9 o'clock. Just as I was getting over the fence that divided Mr. Kemp's fields from ours, out ran Covey with his cowskin to give me another whipping. Before he could reach me, I succeeded in getting to the cornfield, and as the corn was very high, it afforded me the means of hiding. He seemed very angry and searched for me a long time. My behavior was altogether unaccountable. He finally gave up the chase, thinking, I suppose, that I must come home for something to eat. He would give himself no further trouble looking for me. I spent that day mostly in the woods, having the alternative before me to go home and be whipped to death, or stay in the woods and be starved to death. That night, I fell I fell in with Sandy Jenkins, a slave with whom I was somewhat acquainted. Some water. So it looks like we'll just go to the end. Chapter 10, it's quite long. Might not make it to the end of chapter 10. Pick up, might go for another 8 minutes, 1 hour, and then have to do a part 4. So that is the night I fell in with Sandy Jenkins, a slave with whom I was somewhat acquainted. Sandy had a free wife, who lived about 4 miles from Mr. Covey's, and it being Saturday, he was on his way to see her. I told him my circumstances, and he very kindly invited me to go home with him. I went home with him and talked the whole matter over, and got his advice as to what course was best for me to pursue. I found Sandy an old adviser. He told me with great solemnity that I must go back to Covey, but that before I went, I must go with him to another part of the woods where there was a certain root which, if I would take some of it with me, carrying it always on my right side, would render it impossible for Mr. Covey or any other white man to whip me. He said he carried it for years, and since he had done so, he had never received a blow and never expected while he carried it. I at first rejected the idea that the simple carrying of a root in my pocket would have such an effect as he said, and was not disposed to take it. But Sandy impressed me the necessity with much earnestness, telling me it could do no harm if it did no good. To please him, I at length took the root, and according to his direction carried it upon my right side. This was Sunday morning. I immediately started for home, and upon entering the gate came to Mr. Covey on his way to meeting. He spoke to me very kindly, bade me drive the pigs from the lot nearby, and passed on toward the church. Now, singular conduct of Mr. Covey really made me begin to think that there was something in the route which Sandy had given me, and it had been another day than Sunday. If and had it been another day than Sunday, I could have attributed the conduct to no other cause than the influence that was the root. And as it was, I was half inclined to think the root had something more than I had first taken it to be. All went well till Monday morning. On this morning, the virtue of the root was fully tested. Long before daylight, I was called to go and rub curry and feed the horses. I obeyed and was glad to obey, but whilst thus engaged, whilst in the act of throwing down some blades from the loft, Mr. Covey entered the stable with a long rope, and just as I was half out of the loft, he caught hold of my legs and was about tying me. As soon as I found what he was up to, I gave a sudden spring, and as I did so, he holding to my legs, I was brought sprawling to the stable floor. Mr. Covey seemed now to think he had me and could do what he pleased, but at this moment, from whence came the spirit I don't know, I resolved to fight, and suiting my actions to the resolution, I seized Covey hard by the throat, and as I did so, I rose. He held on to me, and I to him. My resistance was so entirely unexpected that Covey seemed to be taken all aback. He trembled like a leaf. This gave me assurance, and I held him uneasy, causing the blood to run where I touched him with the ends of my fingers. Mr. Covey soon called out to Hughes for help. Hughes came, and while Covey helped me, attempted to tie my right hand. And while Covey held me, attempted to tie my right hand. While he was in the act of doing so, I watched my chance and gave him a heavy kick close under the ribs. The kick fairly sickened Hughes so that he left me in the hands of Mr. Covey. The kick had the effect of not only weakening Hughes, but also Covey. When he saw Hughes bending over with pain, his courage quailed. He asked me if I meant to persist in my resistance. I told him I did, come what it might, that he had used me like a brute for 6 months and that I was determined to be used so no longer. With that, he strove to drag me to a stick that was lying at the stable door. He meant to knock me down, but he was just leaning over to get the stick, and I seized him with both hands by his collar and brought him by a sudden snatch to the ground. By this time, Bill came. Covey called upon him for assistance. Bill wanted to know what he could do. Covey said, "Take hold of him, take hold of him." Bill said his master hired him out to work and not to help with me. So he left Covey and myself to fight our own battle out. We were at it for nearly 2 hours. Covey at length let me go, and puffing and blowing at a great rate, saying that if I had not resisted, he would not have whipped me so much. The truth was that he had not whipped me at all. I considered him getting entirely the worst end of the bargain, for he had drawn no blood from me, but I had from him. The whole 6 months afterwards that I spent with Mr. Covey, he never laid the weight of his finger upon me in anger. He would occasionally say he didn't want to get a hold of me. No, I thought, you need not, for you will come off worse than you did before. The battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. It recalled the departed self-confidence, inspired me again with the determination to be free. The gratification afforded by the triumph was a full compensation uh, might for whatever else might follow, even death itself. He can only understand the deep satisfaction with which I experienced who he himself has been repelled by the force of the bloody arm of slavery. I felt as I never felt before. It was a glorious resurrection from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. My long crushed spirit rose, cowardice departed, bold defiance took in its place. And I now resolved that, however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. I did not hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me. From this time I was never again what might be called fairly whipped, though I remained a slave 4 years afterward. I had several fights, but I was never whipped. It was for a long time a matter of surprise to me why Mr. Covey did not immediately have me taken by the constable to the whipping post and thereby regularly whipped for the crime of raising my hand against the white man in defense of myself. And the only explanation I can think of now does not entirely satisfy me. But such as it is, I will give it. Mr. Covey enjoyed the most unbounded reputation for being the first rate overseer, the most unbounded, a Negro breaker. It was of considerable importance to him. The reputation was at stake, and had he sent me, a boy about 16 years old, to the public whipping post, his reputation would have been lost. So, to save his reputation, he suffered me to go unpunished. My term of actual service to Mr. Edward Covey ended on Christmas Day, 1833. The days between Christmas and New Year's are always allowed as holidays, and accordingly, we were not required to perform any labor more than to feed and take care of the stock. This time this time we regard it as our own by the grace of our masters, and we therefore used or abused it nearly as we pleased. Those of us who had families at a distance were generally allowed to spend the whole 6 days in their society. This time, however, was spent in various ways. The staid, sober, thinking, and industrious ones of our numbers would employ themselves in making corn brooms, mats, horse collars, and baskets. And another class of us would spend the time in hunting possums, hares, and coons. But by far the larger part engaged in such sports and merriments as playing ball, wrestling, running foot races, fiddling, dancing, and drinking whiskey. And this latter mode of spending the time was by far the most agreeable to the feelings of our masters. A slave who would work during the holidays was considered by our masters as scarcely deserving to them. He was regarded as the one who rejected the favor of his master. It was deemed a disgrace to not get drunk on Christmas. And he was regarded as lazy, indeed, who did not provide himself with the necessary means during the year to get whiskey enough to last him through Christmas. From what I know the effect of these holidays upon the slave, I believe them to be among the most effective means in the hands of a slaveholder in keeping down the spirit of the insurrection. Were the slaveholders at once to abandon this practice, I have not the slightest doubt that it would lead to an immediate insurrection among slaves. The holidays serve as conductors or safety valves to carry off the rebellious spirit of the enslaved humanity. But for these, the slave would be forced up on the wildest desperation, and woe betide the slaveholder the day he ventures to remove or hinder the operation of those conductors. I warn him that, in such an event, a spirit will go forth in their midst, more to be dreaded than the most appalling earthquake. The holidays are a part and parcel of gross fraud, wrong, and inhumanity of slavery. They are professedly a custom established by the benevolence of slaveholders, but I undertake to say it is the result of selfishness and one of the grossest frauds committed upon the downtrodden slave. They do not give these slaves this time because they would not like to have their work done during this continuance, but because they know it would be unsafe to deprive them of it. This will be first seen by the fact that slaveholders like to have their slaves spend those days just in such a manner as to make them as glad of their ending as their beginning. Their object seems to be to disgust their slaves with freedom by plunging them into the lowest depths of dissipation. For instance, the slaveholders not only like to see the slave drink in his own accord, but will adopt various plans to make him drunk. One plan is to make bets on their slaves as who can drink the most whiskey without getting drunk. And in this way, they succeed in getting whole multitudes to drink to the excess. Thus, when the slave asks for virtuous freedom, the cunning slaveholder, knowing his ignorance, cheats him with those doses of vicious dissipation, artfully labeled them in the name of liberty. The most of us used to drink it down. The result was what might be supposed. Many of us were led to think that there was little choice between liberty and slavery. We felt very properly too that we had almost as well to be slaves as to rum. So when the holidays ended, we staggered up from with the filth of our wallowing, took a long breath, and marched to the field, feeling upon the whole rather glad to go from what our master had deceived us into belief was freedom, back into the arms of slavery. I have said this mode of treatment is part of the whole system of fraud and inhumanity of slavery. It is so. The mode here adopted to discuss the slave with freedom by allowing him to see only the abuse of it is carried out in other things. For instance, a slave loves molasses. Uh, he steals some. His master, in many cases, goes off to town and buys a large quantity. He returns, takes his whip, and commands the slave to eat the molasses until the poor fellow is made sick of the very mention of it. The same mode of sometimes adopted to make slaves refrain from asking for more food than their regular allowance. A slave runs through his allowance and applies for more. His master is enraged at him, but not willing to send him off without food, gives him more than his is necessary and compels him to eat it within a given time frame. Then, if he complains that he cannot eat it, he is said to be satisfied, neither full nor fasting, and is whipped for being hard to please. I have abundance of such illustrations of the same principle drawn from my own observation, but think the cases I have cited sufficient. The practice is a very common one. So we'll pause right here. I'm on page 68 in my version, which is somewhere in the middle of chapter 10, which is quite a long chapter indeed. It's another 15 pages. So that's where we will pick up in part 4. If you just happen to tune in, there are down in the description a link to parts 1 and 2 so you can catch up, follow along. And, it's certainly not easy reading in the sense of the content itself is, as we talked about, has some very stark pictures that are painted, but certainly ones that we need to talk about and we need to discuss if we're going to have any real discussion about what is liberty, what is freedom, and how a country can can be based on liberty if it is born out of a tradition of slavery or among a tradition of slavery at least. So let me know what you think about those ideas and those comments down below. Let me know if there's any other books that you want to read. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check in throughout the week for our other live shows and conversations. Till next time, keep staying beautiful. And remember, when you think free, you live free.